Hi, I'm Johnny Lewis, and I'm presenting Module 12, case study Copyright and Computer Issues. The setting for our case study is St. Regis School. It's a rural K through 8 school that has limited resources and a small number of students. Most of the resources for St. Regis School come from minimal state funding and two major fundraisers that are held each year. Mr. Sample is the third year principal. He's from out of town. He has a high percentage of support in year 3 from the faculty at the school. Here's the situation for today's case study. A detailed plan was made and followed to raise support for computer labs and software that was requested by the faculty for the school. Mrs. Lynn, who is the media specialist, began making illegal copies of this new software from the lab because several teachers had requested that they could have the software both in the lab and in their classroom. So this was a way to have students use them in both places. She viewed this as a way to support the school by saving money and supporting student learning. Mrs. Brandon, who is a new teacher, has approached you, or me, Mr. Sample, about this violation of copyright and expressed her discomfort in participating in these activities. When Mr. Sample approached Mrs. Lynn, she admitted to the practice and offered to approach the PTA herself to inform them of the savings it will offer the school district. Mrs. Lynn argues to Mr. Sample that no one will find out about the copyright violation in this rural district that's so far away from the city that it will benefit student learning and save the district money. And you, Mr. Sample, must now decide how to respond to this situation. Well, first, there are some different options for response. One option for response would be for Mr. Sample to do nothing. Teacher support for Mr. Sample is high. Many teachers appear to support the copying of the software, and it does save the district money and does support student learning. And Mrs. Lynn is probably right. No one will likely ever find out about these copyright violations in a rural school district. And Mr. Sample can say that he asked her to stop copying if anyone questions him. Here are the risks for Mr. Sample choosing not to do anything. Mr. Sample is putting himself, Mrs. Lynn, and the district at risk of litigation and financial penalties, which, as we will see, could actually be more expensive than paying for the additional software if it is discovered. There is research that suggests that more rural districts and small districts are being sought out and punished for copyright infringement. Mr. Sample is violating the standards of his position as a building leader by acting unethically. In fact, to ignore this behavior is to condone illegal behavior, and it models illegal behavior for students who become aware of how it is being copied. Mr. Sample then risks losing the respect of, as a building leader, of Mrs. Brandon and the potential other staff who would share her concerns. Here is my proposed response for Mr. Sample. I propose first a short-term response and then a long-term response. Here's a proposed first responses. Investigate and prepare a description of the potential financial risks of copyright infringement. Review the district's policy as it relates to copyright, if there is one. And if so, it should cover this issue and explain what the appropriate response is. Then this information needs to be gathered up and shared with Mrs. Lynn, the staff, and the PTA. And then, once everyone knows what the ramifications are of continuing to engage in these illegal copyright activities, one can allow the teachers the option to choose whether they want to have these legally purchased copies of software installed in the media center or in their classrooms. Obviously, you can't do both legally at this point, but you can offer that option, which gives teachers some autonomy. And then insist that the copying of software stop immediately and that the copies that were previously made be destroyed in order to avoid putting the school at risk. Here are the justifications for this short-term response. Note that the words highlighted in red relate to the area of learning for this particular case study. A district in Houston, Texas was forced to pay $9.2 million for copyright infringement. The district argued that they were fairly using test prep materials that were widely copied and were known about by staff. The court ruled against them. Thus, school resources are at risk. This same article by Kennedy references the fact that smaller districts are becoming more likely to be sought out and to be punished for copyright infringement than they have been in the past. Secondly, the use of copied material in this particular instance does not meet the standard for fair use. The copied material was not being used for something creative. It wasn't being used to create something new. The copied material was being used for the same purpose that it was created for. It was created to be used in school classrooms. And it was being copied specifically to avoid paying the price for that material and still use the way it was set to be used. This violates copyright law and regulation according to the U.S. Copyright Office. Another justification for this short-term response is that ethical leaders have to consider all consequences of their choices as it relates to school-level governance. In this particular case, it is not enough for Mr. Sample to just say that he warned Mrs. Lynn. He has to think about the consequences that are at play for the district and for the school if this behavior continues. Secondly, giving teachers choice in where they can install software in the short term is consistent with an ethical management style. This kind of management practice models ethical behavior, it avoids illegality, but it honors a building leader's commitment to staff autonomy and to what the staff suggests is student learning. And then why does all of this need to be communicated to others? Well, ethical leaders communicate the purpose and methodology of actions to staff and stakeholders, and that invites their full participation and feedback. More justifications for this short-term response. Best practices for school copyright policy should include specific definitions of appropriate copyright use as it relates to technology. So if the district has a copyright policy, and it's done well, it should already include information. If the district happens to have a policy that's similar to my district's policy, this essentially states that the district won't represent or advocate for any staff member accused of a copyright violation. Therefore, the proposed response encourages the well-being of staff and helps them to avoid litigation and the potential loss of a career. And then lastly, and I think very importantly, ethical use of copyright material is not just about the legal and financial ramifications. It's about promoting future success for students. It's about teaching students to value the work of others, prepares them for collegiate concerns related to plagiarism, and it helps them to see leaders in their school in an ethical light instead of seeing illegality being excused by school leaders. And then I want to propose, secondly, a long-term response. So once the short-term response has happened and we've kind of put a Band-Aid on things, in the long term, it seems that it would be important to invite a team of staff to research and develop or revise the copyright policy so that it specifically states the district's copyright policy so teachers and staff understand how to determine what is acceptable copyright use. I'm assuming that if the media center director is not aware of the district's policy enough to not engage in it, then either it doesn't exist, isn't clear, or hasn't been taught. Secondly, to engage the PTA and other leaders to develop a fundraising strategy similar to the one that they used to purchase computers and software that's already in use in those classrooms so that they can have legal copies of the software. And then lastly, to develop and carry out an annual training that clearly conveys revised acceptable use policies and copyright policies that identify appropriate use of copyrighted materials, the risks of not using copyrighted materials appropriately, and district response to violations. Here are some justifications for this long-term response. Ethical leaders use operating systems which develop teams to make decisions. They don't just do things on their own. They problem solve, they assess needs, they consider consequences, and develop solutions for identified problems. Mrs. Lynn, in this particular instance, meant well, but one of the issues with her solution is not just that she violates copyright law, but she didn't engage others in determining what the best way forward was. She just took it on herself to begin copying these things. Even though we had already had a healthy model for fundraising that was modeled by the school in the way that they developed the computer lab. Mr. Sample can overcome some potential fallout with staff who prefer the copies and with parents and stakeholders by making them aware of the ethical and legal issues and then engaging them in ethical solutions that are focused on student and staff well-being for the long term. Another reason to justify this response is that best practice for building leaders include operating systems that ensure copyright policies are in place, that follow laws and regulations, that have been communicated to and understood by and approved by stakeholders. This includes the Board of Education, and then training staff in this district policy to encourage staff awareness and well-being as it relates to copyright infringement, and then asking for signed confirmation that the staff has received and understood board policy, which then protects the ethical and financial resources of the district. In considering this case study, I have been influenced as a future building leader by being reminded of the importance of being proactive in understanding and implementing and communicating copyright policy to staff so that I could avoid being in Mr. Sample's position in the first place, to understand that policy and make sure that we're communicating it on the front end so we're not running into this. Mr. Sample was 3 years into his tenure and apparently had not discussed copyright with the staff. And then it also encourages me to be aware that my practices as a leader, even in issues that others may view as smaller, like something like software copyright, they have the ability to define my character to my staff and to my students, and also to affect the character development of my students and of staff. These are the resources that I used in creating this presentation. Thank you.